Hello, and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds. Today, we're joined by two global sustainability leaders. We have Paul Druckman, the chair of the World Benchmarking Alliance and a member of Workiva's ESG Advisory Council. Paul is also a former member of the Financial Reporting Council and chair of the UK Accounting Standards. We also have with us Jingdong Hua, the Vice Chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board, more commonly referred to as ISSB. Paul and Jingdong, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are so delighted that you're here. Let's jump right into it. COP28 kicks off in Dubai next week. COP is an annual conference hosted by the United Nations that bring together global leaders to combat climate change. We'll be talking about this year's event later in the show and some of the key themes and conversations and get your hot takes as leaders in the global world looking at finance and sustainability together. 2 years ago, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is known as ISSB, was launched actually at COP26. So, Jingdong, I wonder why was ISSB created, and how is this different from other standard bodies like the GRI? I know some work in partnerships, and just could you give our audience a little bit more to understanding the background to this launch at COP?
Indeed, Mandi, the ISSB was born out of COP26 because there is a great recognition that investors need better information on sustainability, including on climate change, for them to make informed decisions. And how do you convert the many great initiatives that happened in the past 20, 30 years, each with great intent, but cumulatively creating a confusing landscape alphabetic soup of different standards that is actually making the investment decision-making more confusing rather than more efficient. And therefore, I think, that recognition was getting stronger and stronger. At the end of the day, the trustees of IFRS Foundation, thought about the possibility, for the foundation to play a role. And definitely through a wide consultation, the feedback was very, very positive. And of course, we benefit from our sister board, the International Accounting Standard Board, setting a great precedence of converging different national accounting standards over the past, many decades. And that obviously give us a great platform to begin that journey to converge the different alphabetic soup of voluntary standards into a global baseline of sustainability disclosure that will connect global financial market, connect investors with companies who want to attract investment. By speaking the same language, everybody benefit from making more informed decisions. So one difference, as you mentioned, with other standards, one is that eventually, just like the international accounting standard, we look forward to a global capital market, primarily a listed public market, to use our standards in a mandatory fashion through national regulatory bodies. That's number one. Number two, obviously, we serve the needs of investors, and other standards are both voluntary, but also they may serve a broader stakeholder group, multi-stakeholder standard. So we are laser focused on the needs of the investor. Let me argue that if we could somehow make the 400 trillion global savings in terms of making better decisions in where they should invest, and they have a better way of analyzing sustainability risk and opportunity, including the first thematic standard, climate standard, that will be good for everyone.
And I would echo that. Our listeners and those tuning in really love the focus of the ISSB, really focused on the risks, the opportunities, the cost, and the targeted stakeholder of the investor. I think that idea of consolidated, one standard, one opportunity for us to consider is something that many are advocating for, and to get really clear on this is for the investor stakeholder. So, thank you both for your advocacy over the years and the work. Now, recently in June of this year, the ISSB issued its first two standards, the IFRS S1 and the IFRS S2. So, real quickly, Jingdong, could you provide a quick overview of both of those standards and include how they were developed so our audience can be thinking about their own practice and alignment and working together towards these global standards?
We certainly didn't start with a vacuum. The work of integrated reporting, CDSB and SASB form a solid foundation. And by now, obviously, TCFD work fully reflected in our standard. So just coming to the two specific standards, and these were done, as I said, based on some good legacy voluntary standard, number one. Number two, based on a broad feedback. We have received 1,400 feedback, substantive feedback from many different stakeholders, investors, preparers, public policy, NGOs, civil society. And we, 14 board members, deliberated carefully and rigorously before we finalized our standards. So standard number one is what we call the general requirement for sustainability disclosure. Let me continue to use the analogy of a new common global language, right? So if we view our standards as a common language, that S1 is a grammar of the language, the vocabulary, the lexicon, the structure of the language. We require we require companies to disclose according to a certain architecture, which is TCFD. We ask them, to do a materiality test based on the same definition in accounting standard. We ask them to report at the same time on sustainability as their accounting disclosure. So they form the annual general financial disclosure. And we also say that while in the future ISSB will develop sector or thematic standards, while that is being developed, it's not an excuse for a company not to disclose material information that have not been included, like in S2 climate, right? So you still have to, based on this general approach, disclose all of your material, which I mean material, sustainability, risk and opportunity. S2 is about climate, right? This is where we require a company to disclose their GHG emission scope 1, 2, and 3. Recognize that 3 is very strongly demanded by investor, and for many companies, scope 3 through that value chain far outweighs the emission from their own S1, S2. So important risk and opportunity factor for investors. We ask companies to articulate their transition risk and their physical risk. We require a company to carry out scenario analysis and reveal their resilience plan, a resilience assessment. And obviously, you need to disclose all material risk and opportunity pertaining to the climate journey against the, if a country has adopted the global commitment to Paris Accord, and of course, that's a benchmark, or if there is a national target that the company needs to comply to, they also have to disclose that. So in a nutshell, that's what we require S1 and S2, and they will become effective January 1st, 2024. We have given a lot of flexibility and what we call relief to make sure that when you speak a new language, nobody can do it with perfection on day one. It's a journey we travel. Therefore, those relief and those flexibility will give companies the initial comfort and encouragement that you should start, right? If you don't have actual data use, emission factor use estimation, we also say that in year one, companies just focus on emission scope 1, 2, we exempt you from disclosing scope 3 because it takes time. And then next year, your scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1, 2 on your supply chain, right? We have other flexibility recognizing different companies in different jurisdictions have different stages of readiness at different resource level. But the message I wanted to take advantage, Mandi, of this podcast is to encourage companies to start that journey and don't wait.
You've got 5 years to the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. You've got these standards and global regulation colliding and coming together, some of the frameworks using the ISSB. And so, what a pivotal year it is. And you can't start, like, think of my own team. We're starting talking about this well in advance to get us on the runway as an organization and as a company. Thinking of that movement with the SDGs and some of the voluntary frameworks, Paul, shifting gears over to you for a moment, I'm just curious. Previous episode, you were here on ESG Talk. We were talking about benchmarking and transparency and where organizations measure in the private sector impact. How do you see the standards rolling out impacting the work of the World Benchmarking Alliance or other voluntary frameworks?
The ISSB standards, of course, as Jingdong has made very clear, are laser focused on investors. Now, of course, investors are interested in anything that's going to be a significant risk or opportunity for the organization itself. However, one also has to think about, what if it doesn't really impact the organization, but it impacts people and the planet, right? And therefore the responsibility of the organization beyond not necessarily just where capital value is involved. And what we need to do is to understand very clearly, there's a blur, it's not as though there's a finite fence around what investors are interested. They're interested in a lot. There are gaps in that. There's a vacuum as well on the one side. So what we do need to do is to understand how these corporates are actually impacting the Sustainable Development Goals, where we're trying to get to stay at 1.5, although that's gone, and I think we all know that. But where these standards, going back to your question, where the ISSB standards are critical, we can rely on the data that's disclosed, yes, within the focus on investors. And therefore, there's a great amount of the information that's going to be used in benchmarks that are wider, have that credibility, that assurance, those global standards. And I think that's the essence of it. And also the comparability, because certainly what our benchmarks do and other benchmarks do is they're very much around comparability. But if you think of the classic in an accounting sense is a full-time employee, how many employees are there at Workiva? Well, it depends how you count it. I'm an accountant, and it's the overall saying, what do you want the number to be? But there is an argument around that because it depends if you include part-timers and all those sorts of things. Whereas what ISSB and standards do is they actually tell you what to do. And there's less of that so that you can get comparability. But it's a critical step to have this, and it will make, frankly, our job easier.
That's right. We're all for making the job easier, and I'm curious, for this one's for the both of you. Where does this take the importance of standards and benchmarking as it relates specifically to sustainability reporting? And Jingdong, I wonder if you wouldn't mind going first and just sharing your thoughts, and then Paul, building on that, if there's things we should consider as we think about sustainability reporting specifically.
Sure, Mandi. And I speak from my past 30 years working in financial market. Both as an issuer, as treasurer of the World Bank, the World Bank actually created the first green bond, but also as head of the World Bank Group pension as the investor in the space, right? So at the end of the day, the eventual goal is to make global financial market more transparent, more accountable, more comparable, more trusted, and more efficient, and reduce costs for everyone, right? And therefore, standards will play that role. I can give you a very specific example. I talked to chief sustainability officer of a big multinational company who told me, Jingdong, the sooner I don't have to report because my company operates in over 100 countries and I have to, my subsidiaries, you count everybody, I have to do 300 to 400 different ESG reporting every year. That's a burden to the company. Not to mention the fact it's going to confuse investors, right? So converging to a single standard, or in the case where there are still like the European standard on their own, how do we make sure we achieve interoperability so that together we also speak similar languages or different dialect of the same language, so that an investor has no difficulty when they open a European company's disclosure, which has to comply with the European standard. Oh, these parts also speak the same language of ISSB, so I have no difficulty understanding. That's interoperability, so that we all converge into a global landscape that everybody speaks the same language, with a bit of dialect. Now that I'm based in Montreal, I do appreciate the Montreal French is slightly different than the Parisian French, but you can understand each other.
Mandi, can I come at this from a very slightly different, because Jingdong has explained it, the reporting side so well. I think it's the impact. It's the impact that it's going to have on businesses that I'm most excited about. Yeah, in terms of what these standards will produce. Because when you report, when you have a mandatory sustainability report, it's going to be the business of the board of directors to approve those sustainability reports. And therefore, they're going to have a lot more attention on it. It's not just something that that is not for their necessarily for their agenda. And allied to that, what that means is it's much more likely that sustainability issues are going to be brought up in the board. And more, I find that the board members that I talk to are raising the issues, possibly even more than the senior executives, because they are aware of their responsibilities as board members. And I really do believe that this is one of the catalysts for significant change in mindset around strategy, business model, and all of that, and mission of organizations. And to me, that's the exciting bit, that this can really make a difference.
Well, I agree. And as we continue down this journey, it's also companies really thinking about the quality of the data that they're releasing. It's a really interesting dialogue. This idea of authenticity, clear-cut action, true transparency, and innovation coming together. All key themes coming out of Climate Week in New York, giving us a sneak preview of COP, what we talked about earlier in the show. So I'm curious from the both of you, what did you see coming out of Climate Week, and what are you thinking is momentum as we head into COP28? And I wonder if, Paul, you might kick us off here.
I think the thing to remember about Climate Week is that it is actually a subset of the General Assembly. It is, they call it UNGA, which is the UN General Assembly. And that was disappointing. There were countries, the UK, France, China, Russia. I mean, China and Russia for different reasons, but there were leaders who weren't there. And that's really disappointing. And, it's almost got to the stage where the UN are having to look at themselves and say, are they fit for purpose? The other side of it is, if you go to Climate Week, which is effectively the capital market side of things and the NGOs, that has an energy that is fantastic. And I think Climate Week, as far as I hear, was full of that. From the march to, the climate pledge. There are now 420 of the major corporates around the world, and I think it's come through that corporates are really, really moving the thing forward. Actually, it's not just corporates; it's the capital markets and the NGOs that are around that space, which will lead on to comments about COP28. And it strikes me that what we need from the UN is guiding principles for corporate accountability. Yes, and that would, some high-level group that would really make that happen. And it isn't going to come from the world's governments. It has to come from us and the likes of Workiva and ISSB and others. And I think that's the really important piece. And the other thing that with that corporate accountability, there's a phrase that we use at the World Benchmarking Alliance is that we need everyone, everywhere, all at once. Yes, we can't subdivide. We have to collaborate and work together. And every little bit that one does is really important.
So as we think about this piece, it's kind of interesting, the theme and the energy from Climate Week is we can and we will. And as we look at the organizing themes of COP, there's technology, innovation, inclusion, frontline communities, and finance. I would love, Jingdong, you shared in the prep for this session, you were a previous engineer. And so I want to get in these two themes, actually a little bit more your personal takes from you and Paul. We've got in COP these two really interesting things happening. One is the Technology and Innovation Hub that's dedicated to a stage and 2 full weeks of programming around technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship to tackle climate change. There's the Innovation Forum that's looking at cutting edge tech. There's this idea that I would love to hear from you is what technologies are you personally excited about in this space that you think is innovative and can create some change?
So Mandi, before I get there, let me also say that I was at Climate Week, and in addition to getting a lot of steps down because running from one event to the other, the message I wanted to share is that my impression of engaging with the corporate side of things is that corporates already recognize that they no longer ask whether they would do ISSB standard or not. That's no longer a question. They are asking, how do we report on scope 3? How do we get our value chain, data collected? I mean, I'm very encouraged because it seems the train has left the station in terms of we embarking on this journey of creating this new lingua franca of sustainability disclosure. So that was a very exciting week for me. So as a former chemical engineer, and this is certainly my personal opinion, I definitely look forward to a breakthrough technology that will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere, because we need disruptive technology to accelerate, the disruption of this inevitable trajectory of much higher temperature. But I have one angle I wanted to put as an ISSB board member. That is, I certainly hope innovation and technology would make the job of collecting sustainability data much easier for everyone, including many SMEs, right? Because eventually, while ISSB standards will start with the big cap listed companies, eventually through value chain, through supply chain, it will touch each and every SME. And many of them are struggling with maintaining their business. If we can automate as much sustainability data generation, collection, and reporting, I think that would also facilitate faster adoption of ISSB standard to benefit this global public policy agenda.
I think that's a really exciting point because there is this collide of innovation and finance. Paul, the other theme that I think about is Finance Day. Finance Day is happening on the Monday, December 4th. Will be partially dedicated to focusing on how finance can play a critical role in addressing climate change. Tell us what your thoughts are as you think about finance and sustainability coming together. I know you recently wrote an article that said, let's make accountants accountable or something, accountable accountants, something along those lines, which is pretty good play on words. And I'd love to hear how this plays a part in the climate agenda.
I have to say, when on the previous podcast that we had, I talked about changing the title of the CFO, the Chief Finance Officer, to being the Chief Value Officer, changing the whole mindset, in terms of the responsibility of finance. It's very interesting, actually. In the UK, our wonderful government have announced that they're pulling back a bit on some of the measures to help with things like not selling any more petrol and diesel cars, etc. They're moving the things out. And it was interesting that the accounting bodies got together and wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister saying this doesn't make sense in the long, if we're actually looking at the broader aspects. And this is not an accounting issue fundamentally, but it is an issue for finance in my thinking, because the finance community are, if we're thinking about accounting in terms of finance, because finance can mean different things, but if we're thinking about accounting, the finance community have the ability to understand, to put in controls, to make sure that systems are in place, to bring credibility, both not just in reporting, but in the information flows that are all through the organization and the processes that are being undergone. And they, at their peril, will not stay in the lead on these things going forward as we move into the world of sustainability. And I truly believe that there is, and in fact, IFAC, which is the International Federation of Accountants, the sort of global body, are really, really strong on this and trying to make sure that the profession actually evolves, challenges itself, and moves forward. Just as an anecdote, Mandi, in the 1980s, right, showing my age here, I was involved in a software house that produced statutory accounts, okay, with floppy disks in IBM PCs. Organizations like Workiva, when I look at what Workiva can do, and I look at what we did in the 1980s, it's we were pretty naive. But nonetheless, joining up what Jingdong said, is that actually that innovation and that technology, allied to the skills of the finance, skills that are there, really can make this a difference and can provide information for the organization to make sure that it is actually fit for purpose going forward into 2030 and beyond. And you guys have a huge responsibility to make sure that corporates especially have that ability to do it with so much data around and so many different routes to understand the data. But the accounting profession is your, to my mind, the biggest ally to make sure that it really does happen. Otherwise, we'll be blown away with data.
Thank you both for your reflections around innovation, around finance, as we look forward to COP happening next week. Now, this is our final question, final moment for quick thoughts from the both of you. 2023 has been this pivotal year for sustainability and finance. And shortly after the ISSB issued their first standards, the European Commission adopted the ESRS, a set of rules that companies will have to follow and comply with for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. By some estimates, they think this is going to impact over 50,000 companies around the world. We're dealing with some of the issues that we talk about at COP and Climate Week, which is macroeconomics and uncertainty, and which can stall growth and can stall investments. So what advice do you have for leaders heading into 2024? Jingdong, would you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, adopting ISSB standards will provide companies with opportunities to increase their sustainability resilience, especially on climate. So this is certainly something that will help them during times of volatility instead of being a burden. I think that's the first thing I wanted to say. And this is why, second, that since we were born at COP26, so each COP serves as sort of a milestone for us to check progress. At COP27, African ministers made a joint statement embracing early acceptance or early adoption of ISSB in Africa and believing that early adoption would attract global investment. And as a matter of fact, Nigerian finance minister personally made a commitment for Nigeria to be one of the earliest adopters of ISSB standard. So we certainly look for similar, more momentum coming up at COP28 for our world. We also, at COP27, launched our global partnership framework for capacity building, believing that in addition to making the standards, it is our commitment and our duty to make sure the global south feel as ready as a global north in terms of adopting our standard so that this is a truly global language instead of just spoken by a few. And therefore, at COP28, we probably will be able to share our progresses in terms of those partnership, the curriculum or the training material, education contents that we are working on in terms of supporting those companies' readiness to early adopt our standards. So watch this space, watch our, monitor our website and monitor our communication and our LinkedIn. I think exciting things will come up in the next couple of weeks.
Just from my point of view, I mean, COP28 is the halfway point, isn't it? Between the Paris Accord and 2030, where so much had to happen. And we are so far away from being halfway along the journey. But as Jingdong so rightly said before, the train has left the station. It just seems to have been going uphill a little in its acceleration rather than downhill. But just moving on to advice, my advice is we need to drive better business behavior. Okay, and that's right across the capital markets. Comply with the standards, prepare for the legislation. Yes, lead. Don't wait for the legislation, prepare for it. Consider wider value towards evaluating impacts, because that's next. Nature is the big force that's coming forward, TNFD coming forward, which the ISSB will have to make decisions about in the near future. Don't just comply and think and follow what's going on, all on a route to integrated thinking, all on a route to having a business and a whole capital market system that thinks right through these issues, not just how to.
Well, let's all continue on that train going uphill as quickly as we can. Paul and Jingdong, thank you for joining the show. It was such a wonderful privilege to have you both on as we head into COP next week.
Thank you very much, Mandi.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you all for joining us for this episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. Stay tuned for next week. We're closing out this season with a very special episode featuring all 4 ESG Talk hosts. Andy, Steve, Ernest, and myself will all be reflecting on how ESG has evolved in 2023 and share our great predictions for 2024. In December, we'll be taking a brief hiatus to replay some of our favorite episodes from Season 1 and 2. We'll be combining episodes around similar topics like measuring the ROI on sustainability and taking a look how the roles of the Chief Financial and Chief Sustainability Officer are changing. And of course, we'll be kicking off Season 3 of ESG Talk at the start of the new year. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll talk real soon.